They called me a burden at dinner, and before the plates went cold, the sentence chose a room inside me and started renovating the walls, hanging its own frames, repainting memories in the shade it preferred. If a single word could redecorate a life, would you still sit there and pretend it matched the drapes? Before we begin this journey of hidden truths and midnight envelopes, hit subscribe now, because voices like these deserve to travel far, and stories like this one prove that justice sometimes wears slippers and carries a press badge. Are you ready to see what one envelope in the dark can do to an entire city? Mark swirled his wine as if surface circles could chart the depth of a problem, the burgundy liquid catching light from the chandelier that had watched 3 generations of this family navigate love and disappointment. He said capacity assessment, like a concierge recommending a spa, his tone carrying that practiced compassion reserved for those who believe they know what's best for everyone else. Sarah arranged the potatoes on my plate like a nurse who had been promoted to judge, her movements precise and deliberate, each gesture a small declaration of control. Whose good did they mean when they said, "For everyone's good"? Why does "will handle it" always arrive wearing concern and leave with your keys? The dining room held its breath the way rooms do when they sense a shift in power, the mahogany table reflecting faces that had grown unfamiliar to each other over the years. "Mother," Sarah said, setting down her fork with the precision of a gavel. "I've scheduled a capacity assessment. Standard procedure. It will help everyone." Help everyone? Or help themselves to everything? I kept my voice level as I asked what everyone meant, and Mark leaned forward with that smile salesman perfect in mirrors. "Eleanor, be reasonable. This market won't last. You sign now, we invest. Everyone wins. Everyone except the woman whose signature they needed, whose house they coveted, whose competence they questioned while depending on her compliance. When someone questions your mind, are they worried about your thoughts or their access to your assets?" I touched the napkin to lips that had once questioned mayors and called out corruption in rooms where women's voices were unwelcome, where persistence was mistaken for pushiness and accuracy was dismissed as attitude. The irony tasted bitter. Now, my own family wielded the same tactics I had spent decades exposing. "It is my house," I said. Not loudly, not meekly. A simple filing of fact that landed in the room like evidence presented to a jury. Sarah exhaled like I had forced her into rudeness, her frustration performing for an audience of 2. "Mother, we've gone over this. You're having episodes. You forgot your pills twice last week. Mark found them in the bread box." Episodes. Such a clinical word for the crime of inconvenience. I had put those pills in the bread box because the kitchen sunlight warmed the capsules, and my hands didn't ache so much when I took them. But explaining care to people who see only chaos is like describing color to those who prefer everything in black and white. "I put them there," I replied, watching their silence stretch like a held breath. "My mind is not a bread box, darling." But perhaps theirs was, I thought, full of stale assumptions and moldy motivations. Sarah's eyes hardened, 2 brown stones that had once sparkled with childhood wonder before disappointment taught them to calculate. "This is exactly what I mean. You make jokes. You deflect. Deflection." Yes, it had kept me alive in rooms where men wanted me small, where truth was unwelcome and questions were treated as attacks. But I was not joking now. "The body is a frayed cable," I said, meeting her gaze. "The current, however, is intact." When they moved their conversation upstairs, their whispers traveling through walls like a second plumbing system, I stepped onto the front porch for air that didn't taste of condescension. Mrs. Klein from across the street halted mid-stride when she saw me, her expression shifting from recognition to something colder. She used to bring me lemon squares for the 4th of July, back when neighbors were neighbors and not audiences for family drama. Today she pulled her cardigan tighter and nodded without warmth, as if proximity to me might be contagious. Have you ever felt friendship withdraw like a tide, leaving you stranded on the shore of your own reputation? Another neighbor, young and elastic in gym clothes, glanced at me with pity that felt crueler than contempt. Poor thing, she murmured to her phone, not bothering to lower her voice. Poor thing. As if I could not hear, as if age had stolen my ears along with my credibility. When I reached the gate, a car idled by, and from the back seat, a crushed soda can arced into my garden, nicking the soil with a hollow sound that echoed like mockery. I heard laughter fade with the engine, and my hand trembled, not with shock, but with recognition. I had seen this before. Discredit the witness before they can speak. Inside, the parlor held its breath while afternoon light painted patterns on walls that remembered when this house rang with typewriter keys and ringing phones, when deadlines meant something, and truth was a weapon worth wielding. In the far corner rested my Remington, a bull of a typewriter that once shook these floors with stories that mattered. Its ribbon was long-dried, but the keys still faced upward like teeth, ready to bite into paper if paper still mattered in a world of screens and spin. I ran my finger over the D, the F, the J, with their homing ridges, and memory rose clean as glass. A night in 1976, neon painting the newsroom window, the editor pacing with coffee going cold, my copy landing hot and precise on his desk. There was a part of me still that woman, hungry, unafraid, certain the world could be steered by words if they were accurate enough, but certainty was a lighter now, not a torch, and the flame needed careful tending. Above me the attic settled with its familiar groan, the sound of old wood adjusting to its burden. Sarah called it a fire hazard. Mark called it wasted space, but I had called it storage for longer than memory served. Storage. Such a small word for such a large purpose. It was a vault, really, holding winters and summers, tapes that clicked with secrets, journals with spines like tired birds, documents that democracy had forgotten, but justice might remember. When the house grew quiet and darkness gave permission, to move without explanation, I would climb those stairs. When truth needed excavation, I knew where to find the tools. Night opened like a file cabinet, and I went upstairs with one hand on the rail and one hand on the past, counting steps not like an old woman counts breaths, but like a reporter counts sources. 2 is risky, 3 is strong, 4 is a story. Worth telling. The attic stairs had grown steeper over the years. Or perhaps my legs had grown more honest about their limitations. But determination is a different kind of muscle, one that strengthens with use rather than weakening with age. Do you have a room that knows your real name, that remembers who you were before the world decided who you should be? The attic did. It greeted me with cedar dust and the soft thud of memory settling into place, the air thick with decades of stored intention. The key was exactly where a younger version of me had hoped a future version would find it, sewn into the lining of an old coat with the stubborn stitch my husband used when he mended things others threw away. Harold always said if something was worth keeping, it was worth keeping safe, and he had sewn that key with the care of a man who understood that some secrets are not shame, but strategy. If a memory is mended well, can it carry weight when the world tries to break it again? The lock turned like a throat clearing, releasing 20 years of held breath. The trunk's mouth opened on treasures disguised as paper, diaries whose spines had learned to bow under the weight of truth, cassettes labeled in my cramped handwriting with dates that still carried temperature, Photocopies whose toner had survived. Seasons of forgetting. What breaks first in the archaeology of justice? Paper or nerve? I selected a tape at random. One marked MR, March 00, payment discussions, and slid it into the old recorder I kept for moments like this. My finger hesitated over the play button because some truths, once heard, cannot be unheard, and some betrayals, once witnessed, rewrite every conversation that came before. But hesitation is just fear wearing formal clothes, and I had attended enough fear's dinner parties to recognize the dress code. The plastic square clicked, and Mark's voice filled the dusty air. Younger then, but already wearing that purchased certainty like cologne. "Tell him it's taken care of," his voice said, scratchy but unmistakable. The envelope was delivered. No one's going to talk as long as she keeps her mouth shut. She, a woman reduced to a pronoun, a person converted to a problem, a life simplified to a liability. Then came Sarah's voice, my daughter's voice, floating through time like smoke through a keyhole. "Good. The last thing we need is her poking around. She doesn't understand how things work anymore." When a daughter's voice escorts a secret into a dark room, who turned off the light? When your child speaks about you in the third person, while you're in the first person's pain, which person are you allowed to be? The sound of my own breathing filled the pause between their recorded words, my heart keeping time like a metronome, set to betrayal. I rewound the tape and played it again, searching for some other interpretation, some innocent explanation that would return my faith to its proper address. But clarity is not negotiable, and truth does not accept alternative, facts as payment. Among the papers, I found records that told a story my family had been careful not to read aloud. Deposits that lined up with Mark's promotion announcements. Contracts awarded to his company just days after payments appeared in offshore accounts. Emails where Sarah's name appeared as a knowing participant rather than an innocent bystander. How long does it take for suspicion to harden into evidence? For me, it was the length of one long night, surrounded by proof that my daughter had not been seduced by corruption, but had courted it, had not been fooled by her husband's schemes, but had helped design them. The files were organized with the precision of someone who understood that secrets, like stories, need structure to survive. Financial records arranged by date, correspondence sorted by recipient, photographs of documents that should never have existed, capturing handshakes that should never have happened. I had built cases like this before, back when justice wore a press badge and truth carried a byline, but never with my heart breaking in real time, never with love dissolving in the developer like an overexposed photograph. Do you know the particular weight of evidence when it's wrapped in betrayal? When facts arrive wearing the faces of people you would have died to protect. Each page turned like a door closing, each revelation a room in the house of my family's deception that I had never been invited to visit. But houses, like hearts, have hidden passages, and sometimes the locked door leads to the light switch. As dawn approached, I understood that the choice was not whether to act, but how to act, with precision rather than pain, with justice rather than vengeance. The woman who had once restructured a city's understanding of itself was still here, still breathing, still capable of one more story that mattered. The attic had kept its promise, truth preserved, evidence maintained, justice on pause but not on permanent vacation. When I finally descended those stairs, I carried more than memories. I carried ammunition. But ammunition, like power, is only as effective as the person willing to use it with purpose rather than rage. The question was not whether I could destroy them. The question was whether I could save myself without becoming the villain in my own story. When morning came, I would have to decide which mattered more, the family I had lost or the woman I had found again in a room full of dust and proof. Sometimes the hardest truth to face is not what others have done to you, but what you must do to reclaim yourself from their version of who you are supposed to be. Mourning would have been easier because temptation always prefers light, but I chose the work that darkness makes possible, the careful archaeology of assembling truth from fragments scattered across years of careful deception. Lists grew ribcages around the skeleton of their crime. Dates when payments appeared, nights when meetings happened, moments when democracy was auctioned to the highest bidder with my son-in-law as both auctioneer and buyer. What matters more in a fight? Youths, speed or methods patience? While the kettle forgot to sing downstairs and the house settled into its morning routine of muffled footsteps and closing doors, I remembered how an investigation breathes. Inhale the chaos, exhale the pattern. Let the facts arrange themselves into something that resembles justice wearing work clothes. Every time my hands trembled with age or exhaustion, the page steadied them with purpose. If you cannot stop a heart from stuttering under the weight of betrayal, can you at least keep the handwriting straight lines toward truth? Under the floorboard, because sometimes safety is simply a polite word for strategic hiding, I created a library of evidence, sliding packets into the space between foundation and floor, the way a tide slides secrets under a pier. The wood grain became a map of my intentions. Here the financial records that connected Mark's company to contracts worth millions. There, the correspondence that proved Sarah's knowledge and participation. Everywhere, the proof that what they called my confusion was actually their coordination. What would you hide if the house were your witness and the walls had promised to keep your secrets until justice came calling? Each packet represented hours of cross-referencing, of following money through its migrations from public coffers to private accounts, of tracing influence through its journey from handshake to headline to the silence that followed. The work was methodical in the way that mattered, not rushed by anger or slowed by sentiment, but measured by the precision that turned suspicion into conviction. Do you trust evidence the way you trust gravity? Or do you need to test it first by dropping something valuable and watching it fall? At the window, dawn painted the street in watercolors that bled at the edges, and I watched neighbors begin their rituals of ordinary life. Dogs walked, papers retrieved, coffee cups lifted to lips that would gossip about my capacity while sipping. From mugs purchased with paychecks earned in offices, where my former colleagues once fought similar battles against different villains. The irony was not lost on me that I had spent decades exposing corruption in government while it metastasized in my own dining room, had investigated the misuse of public trust while my family practiced the theft of private faith. But irony, like revenge, is a luxury that justice cannot afford. When the time came to act, it would have to be with surgical precision rather than emotional satisfaction. I wrote the covering note in block letters that looked like someone else's courage borrowing my pen, each character formed with the deliberate care of someone who understands that handwriting is evidence, and evidence becomes Exhibit A when lawyers start asking questions. No names on the envelope. Why give them identities when actions speak louder than introductions, when behavior is more honest than biography? Only dates, amounts, account numbers, and the kind of documentation that transforms, whispered accusations into courtroom certainties. The note was brief. The attached materials document a pattern of corruption involving public contracts, private payments, and the deliberate misuse of municipal resources. All facts can be verified through public records. The public deserves to know. Do you trust the mailbox the way you trust a friend, or the way you trust gravity? With the faith that what goes in must come out somewhere else, changed by the journey. The walk to the corner was longer than geography suggested, each step carrying the weight of a decision that could not be undone, would not be taken back, should not be regretted even when the consequences arrived, wearing badges and carrying warrants. The street lamp spread a small theatrical circle on the pavement, as if it had auditioned for daylight and been told it was better at creating atmosphere than illumination. The mailbox stood like a blue sentinel, patient and impartial, ready to transform private truth into public record with the simple act of opening its mouth and accepting what I offered. If truth leaves your hand in darkness, does it grow wings or witnesses by the time it reaches its destination? The envelope disappeared into the slot with a sound like a period ending a sentence that had taken years to write. Somewhere in the city, a newsroom would wake to find my voice again, though they would not know the throat it came from, or the heart that had broken to produce it. My editor from the old days was dead, buried with honors and a press badge that matched the one tucked in my cardigan pocket. But newspapers are organisms that outlive their individual cells, and somewhere a younger version of my former self would open that envelope and feel the familiar quickening that comes when story meets storyteller. The walk home was different. Not lighter exactly, but cleaner, like a room after the truth has finally been spoken aloud, and the lies have packed their bags and moved out. The house waited with its windows dark, and its secrets soon to be illuminated, by strangers with cameras and questions, by officers with warrants, and lawyers with subpoenas, by the machinery of justice that grinds slow, but grinds fine, when fed the proper fuel. Inside, I made tea with sugar because small rebellions matter when large ones are already in motion, and I sat in my husband's chair because widows have the right to occupy all the spaces love used to fill. If a city wakes slower than a lie, what happens when you ring the right bell at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right amount of force? By evening I would know. By morning they would too. Engines stitched the morning together with the precision of seamstresses who specialized in scandal. The news vans arriving like white flowers with metal stems, their satellite dishes craning toward a sky that pretended not to be listening, while recording every frequency. When an entire neighborhood rehearses indifference, who distributed the script? And why does everyone know their lines so perfectly? The front page had landed with the weight of a gavel. City contracts linked to bribes. Local officials accused of systematic corruption. My anonymous envelope had found its voice in someone else's byline. My carefully assembled evidence transformed into the kind of story I used to write when justice wore a younger face, and corruption seemed like someone else's family business. Mark descended the stairs like an argument falling down each step, his phone pressed to his ear with the desperation of a man trying to control a narrative that had already escaped his influence. "Don't talk to me about damage control." His voice carried the harsh rasp of someone who had spent the night learning that some secrets refuse to stay buried. "This is a hit job. It's political." Political, the last refuge of men who mistake exposure for persecution, who confuse accountability with conspiracy. He turned toward me with eyes that had learned to calculate guilt by measuring the distance between accusation and evidence. You did this." It was not a question because questions leave room for doubt, and doubt was a luxury he could no longer afford. Must the truth announce itself with fanfare to be believed? Or is a steady gaze testimony enough when the facts speak louder than denials? I answered with the kind of silence that courtrooms recognize as more honest than words, the quiet that falls when all the lies have been told, and only truth remains, standing in the room. Sarah appeared in the hallway like a ghost of her former certainty, barefoot and pale, clutching her phone like a talisman that had forgotten how to perform miracles. The woman who had arranged my pills like a nurse and my future like a judge now stood small in her own hallway, diminished by the recognition that control is temporary, but consequences have permanent addresses. They know everything, she whispered, her voice carrying the hollowness of a bell that has been struck once too often. Everything. Such a large word for such a specific betrayal, such a final word for such a long deception. What hurts more? When truth arrives, wearing a uniform, the lie itself, or the moment when the liar realizes that lying was never actually a sustainable career path? Enough, I said, measuring my words like ingredients in a recipe that had to be perfect on the first try, enough to stop the part that kept growing. 3 sharp knocks interrupted our accounting of consequences, the sound official and impatient, democracy's way of announcing that some conversations are too important for whispers. When I opened the door, 2 police officers stood there with the kind of professional courtesy that accompanies search warrants, their presence transforming my threshold from private space to public record. Behind them, a detective whose eyes did not move from mine carried the particular stillness of someone who had read the evidence before breakfast and understood that paperwork was about to become handcuffs. Ma'am, we have a warrant to search these premises for documents related to an ongoing investigation. The officer's voice was respectful in the way that law enforcement reserves for citizens who are witnesses rather than suspects, victims rather than perpetrators, sources rather than subjects. I stepped aside because cooperation is what innocence looks like when it wears clothes and answers doors, when it has nothing to hide and everything to reveal. The house exhaled as if buildings could feel relief, as if walls that had held secrets too long were finally free to let strangers catalog what should never have been hidden. Have you ever felt a home get lighter? Not because furniture was removed, but because lies were finally being carried away in boxes marked evidence. The search was methodical rather than destructive, professional rather than personal. Each room examined with the thoroughness of people who understood that justice requires precision and democracy demands documentation. They moved through spaces that had trained me to be small, through rooms where I had learned to whisper truths that should have been shouted, through hallways that had echoed with my family's gaslighting, while the walls themselves waited for witnesses with badges and "Subuenas." Mark's voice rose from upstairs, indignant and desperate, the sound of a man who had confused volume with authority for so long that he could not adjust his frequency when circumstances changed the channel. "This is harassment," he shouted to no one in particular and everyone in general. "This is a violation of our rights." Rights. Such an interesting word from someone who had spent years negotiating other people's rights away for the right price, who had purchased influence with public money and called it business development. The officers worked with quiet efficiency, photographing documents, cataloging correspondence, transforming my daughter's careful participation in corruption into evidence that would speak in courtrooms where volume matters less than validity. Sarah stood in the doorway watching her careful complicity become a matter of public record, her phone finally silent, because some conversations cannot be spun and some truths cannot be managed through better messaging. What does a family look like when law enforcement becomes the narrator, when private betrayals become public testimony, when the people you trusted with your weakness become the people you must face in your strength? The search took hours that felt like minutes because justice, when it finally arrives, moves with the efficiency of something that has been delayed too long and refuses to waste any more time. Files that had lived in shadows were photographed in bright light. Tapes that had whispered secrets were labeled as exhibits. Documents that had hidden in plain sight were inventoried as evidence that democracy still had a voice when citizens remembered how to use it. By afternoon, the house stood different. Not emptied, but clarified. Not violated, but validated. Not invaded, but finally inhabited by truth that had been locked out for too long. The officers departed with boxes that contained years of my family's careful corruption, with evidence that would transform whispered accusations into courtroom certainties, with proof that some secrets grow more dangerous the longer they are kept. When the last box disappeared into the back of an official vehicle, I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of a house that had finally remembered its purpose as a home, rather than a hiding place. Outside, neighbors who had whispered about my capacity now, whispered about my courage, their conversations shifting from pity to respect, from concern to admiration. The same people who had treated me like a burden now treated me like a woman who had carried truth to its proper destination. If power changes address when the facts finally come home, who decides where the furniture goes in the new arrangement? After the boxes left carrying their cargo of consequences, afternoon folded the edges of the day with a care I had not been afforded in months, and the house settled into a quietness that felt earned rather than imposed, chosen rather than forced, peaceful rather than merely silent. She arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, in a navy suit that spoke of boardrooms, conquered, and cases won, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had learned that power is not taken, but earned, not inherited but achieved through the patient accumulation of competence and the careful deployment of justice. Anna, though she now went by Anna Catherine Morrison, Esquire, partner at Morrison, Chen and Associates, still moved with the careful grace of a girl who had once sat in the back of a hearing room with hair that broke your heart and a story that demanded justice. If rescue has a sound, is it the arrival of sirens or the quiet turning of a key in a lock that has kept you prisoner in your own home? We spoke not about punishment, but about protection that tells the truth, rather than stories that obscure it, about safeguards that serve the person rather than systems that serve themselves. The signatures made a small parade across paper that transformed relationships from assumptions to legal certainties. Power of attorney that returned my hand to its proper owner. A will that gave the house to a story that understood what houses are meant to hold. Instructions that replaced manage with respect and control with care. Is justice a gavel that falls once with finality, or a pen that writes new endings for stories that seem to have concluded in someone else's favor? The documents were thorough in the way that mattered, not complicated by legal language designed to obscure meaning, but precise in the manner that protects intention while respecting intelligence. Each clause had been crafted to ensure that my voice would remain my own, that my choices would reflect my values, that my legacy would serve the causes that had shaped my life, rather than the convenience of people who mistook inheritance for entitlement. When we finished, Anna looked across the table with eyes that carried decades of gratitude, but spoke with the voice of professional competence. "You saved my life," she said, her words carrying the weight of truth that had been measured against years of evidence. "I wouldn't be here without your intervention." Did I save her life? Or did I simply recognize my own story, trying to disappear in someone else's narrative? My own voice trying to speak through someone else's silence. The question matters less than the answer it produced. Sometimes saving someone else teaches you how to save yourself. Sometimes justice is a gift that returns to the giver when it is most needed. Sometimes the child you help becomes the adult, who helps you remember who you always were beneath who you were told to become. The afternoon light moved across the sunroom that had been claimed without consent and returned without ceremony, practicing its testimony on surfaces that had witnessed too much silence and not enough truth. When we finished our business, Anna hugged me with the warmth of someone who understood that professional competence and personal gratitude could occupy the same space, that lawyers could be human, and humans could be warriors when the situation required both. People ask whether revenge satisfies, and the question contains its own hunger, its own assumption that justice and vengeance are neighbors who borrow each other's tools. Listen carefully to the question, and you can hear where it learned its appetite for destruction rather than construction, for tearing down rather than building up. Here is a better question. What does it take to remember yourself out loud when others have spent years teaching you to whisper? What does it cost to reclaim your voice when family has convinced you that silence is the price of love? Justice is not rage dressed in formal clothes. It is memory with consequences, truth with teeth, dignity with the power to defend itself against those who mistake kindness for weakness and age for incompetence. When someone calls you a burden, they are not measuring your weight. They are measuring their dependence on your silence, their investment in your diminishment, their need for you to remain small so they can feel large. But burden is a word that works both ways. If I was their burden, what did that make them to me? The house had begun to breathe differently, no longer holding its breath against the next insult or the next assumption, no longer bracing itself for conversations that treated me like a problem, to be solved rather than a person to be respected. The stained glass scattered light like confetti that had learned to read the room, painting walls with colors that celebrated rather than merely decorated, that announced rather than whispered, that insisted on beauty in a space that had been starved for joy. The attic stood empty now, its secrets transferred to official custody, its silence no longer heavy with hidden truth, but light with completed purpose. Purpose, I had learned, does not disappear when objects leave. It lingers in the space between what was and what becomes possible, in the pause between the last lie and the first honest breath. Have you ever noticed how a room changes when secrets stop living there? How walls remember what they were built to hold when lies finally move out and make space for something better? By evening, the news vans had migrated to other stories, their hunger satisfied by the day's revelation that corruption still had consequences and democracy still had defenders, even when those defenders wore slippers and carried memories of better times. The neighbors who had treated me like a curiosity now nodded with something approaching respect, their conversations shifting from whispered concerns about my capacity to open admiration for my courage. Mrs. Klein appeared at my door with lemon, squares that tasted like apology and smelled like the return of friendship that politics and gossip had temporarily relocated. If power changes neighborhoods when truth finally comes home, who gets to decide where the welcome mat belongs? The evening settled around the house like a well-fitted dress, comfortable and dignified, appropriate for the occasion of a life reclaimed. From those who had rented it out without permission, I sat in Harold's chair because widows have the right to occupy all the spaces love used to fill, and I made tea with sugar because small rebellions matter when large ones have already succeeded, when tiny victories celebrate the success of major campaigns. The press badge remained in my cardigan pocket, not as a relic of former glory, but as evidence that some identities transcend age, some voices gain strength with time, some stories improve with patience and careful attention to detail. If this story made something inside you sit up and breathe, subscribe now, so these voices keep traveling across distances and generations. So stories like this one find listeners who understand that justice delayed is not always justice denied, when someone finally remembers how to speak truth to power. Tell me in the comments which moment turned the tide for you. Was it the attic tape that revealed betrayal? The midnight envelope that carried evidence to its destination? Or the morning knock that brought official recognition to unofficial truth? Your voice matters because the next person who feels erased might find a map back to themselves in what you say, in how you respond, in your willingness to witness someone else's victory over those who mistake silence for consent. And if anyone has ever called you a burden, here is a question to carry forward into whatever comes next. Who would you be if you told the truth, even once, in daylight, even if your voice shook, even if the people who benefit from your silence try to convince you that speaking up is somehow wrong? Oh, sometimes the loudest justice is the quietest voice that refuses to be silenced, the steadiest hand that writes the ending they said you were too old to author, the clearest eyes that see through lies designed to make you disappear. You are never too old to remember who you were before they told you who you should be. Never too late to reclaim the voice they said you had lost. Never too weak to carry truth to the place where it can finally do some good.